All right, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for being here for the University of Minnesota Climate Adaptation Partnership monthly webinar. My name is Greg Klinger. I'm an extension educator at the University of Minnesota, and I'll be facilitating this webinar, which is on climate resilience programming and climate cooperative extension. Before we get started, there are just a few housekeeping items I need to share. So I'm going to go ahead and share screen here. See if that'll go ahead and get the slideshow. Just taking a second. In any case, so the webinar is, begun now here at 12 p.m. Central and will end at 1. The participants are muted during the webinar, and then the typical format is we have 35 to 45-minute presentation with some time for a Q&A for anything that it really piques your curiosity during the presentation. And we do record the webinars and we'll post them online at a later date. So with that, let's start getting into the webinar. So as some background, increasing weather extremes, changing weather patterns, and other physical and social impacts of climate change are impacting New York State working lands. And in order to tackle these challenges, New York State has set ambitious targets around greenhouse gas emissions, reduction in carbon sequestration. What does this all mean for farmers? How can Cornell Cooperative Extension help them navigate these challenges and policy opportunities? And how can New York State's approach translate to Minnesota agriculture? So I'd like to introduce our guest for today. Zach Spangler is an ag climate resiliency specialist with Cornell Cooperative Extension's Harvest New York team. His work supports farmers' efforts to contribute to climate change mitigation, improve their ability to respond to stresses, and adapt to changing climate patterns while maintaining or improving farm viability. Prior to joining the Cornell team, the Harvest New York team that is, Zach earned a Master of Science in Disaster Risk Management and Climate Change Adaptation from Lund University of Sweden, where he researched barriers and enablers of farmers' engagement in climate change adaptation. So I'll go ahead and stop sharing, and Zach, if you want to go ahead and take it away, we're all ears.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that great introduction. And hopefully you can see my full-size slides. And I'll just jump right into it. I think you heard a lot about kind of where I'm coming from and kind of my perspective on things, but I'll just reinforce that a little bit, just so you know kind of what my position is and where I'm coming from in this whole wide system. So I work with Cornell Cooperative Extension, again, as an ag climate resiliency specialist. That means climate change and resiliency is what I work on full time. I have a lot of colleagues who incorporate these topics as part of their job, but I have the pleasure of getting to look at these topics all of the time, which can sometimes be a little bit depressing when you're talking to folks about the increasing hazards like drought or flooding. But it gets a little bit more uplifting when I get to talk about some of the potential solutions like agrivoltaics, alley cropping, and other agroforestry practices, biochar, the soil carbon sequestration approach, forest regeneration, and natural deer fencing like slash walls, or manure cover and flare approaches. So I work with an extension on such a wide range of topics. I work with all sorts of different farms, different scales, different production methods, different production products that they're focusing on. So what I'm going to talk to you today about is kind of how why extension is involved in this, kind of the impetus for that, the motivation from New York State's Climate Act, what makes for good mitigation activity, some of the key practices that we're focusing on here in New York, some of the barriers to farmers and other landowners adopting those practices, and how we're going about addressing them. And hopefully in there you'll find something that's either interesting, some sort of compare or contrast to what you're working on, or something that raises some sort of question for you, or spark some sort of idea. So first I want to take a step back and look at New York State's greenhouse gas emissions, just to provide some context. So in the main greenhouse gas accounting, this is broken down into 4 sectors: energy, waste, industrial processes and product uses, and then lumping together all of the agriculture, forestry, and other land uses, which in New York accounts for only 6% of the total emissions. And then within that, you'll notice that animal feeding in the dairy industry, and manure management in the dairy industry is the vast majority of the other emissions, followed by other animal feeding, and then soil nitrogen management. So I also want to point out that in New York State, we selected a 20-year global warming potential numbers, not the normal 100-year global warming potentials that are used by IPCC and others in their accounting. This means some greenhouse gases, methane emissions, look a lot more potent than they would under other forms of accounting. And another thing to think about when we're looking at really any greenhouse gas emissions inventory is where do we assign certain emissions? For example, in New York, the fuel used, the diesel or the gasoline used on a farm as part of an agricultural activity is still part of the energy sector emissions. So keep that in mind when we're talking about different practices that can reduce emissions on farms and things that rural landowners can do. Not all of that's going to happen in the agricultural sector. Some of it will affect the energy sector, the waste sector. I also want to point out that in New York, like in most other places, agriculture, forestry, and other land uses, and mostly forestry, is where all of the sequestration happens. All of that carbon drawdown is happening in that sector at the moment as of 2019. And you'll notice that 78% of this is in forest land, and that's actually decreased from 1990 to 2019. And one thing we frequently talk about in large-scale agriculture is soil carbon sequestration. So one question this raises to me is, at some point, will we flip agricultural soils to becoming net sequesters of carbon through soil health practices? So that's kind of the greenhouse gas emissions background that I want to give. And then I also want to talk about kind of the more tangible impacts of climate change that we're expecting. And I think having real data is very helpful to folks. So I've given you some specific numbers here. These are for a specific region in Eastern New York, but really the numbers don't vary a whole lot across the state. And the trends are going to be the same across most of the northern US. As far as there's going to be some amount of average warming, heat waves and extreme heat events are going to increase throughout the region. And particularly concerning to me is the new occurrence of extraordinarily hot days. So the number of days over 105 degrees is going to increase, and that's going to have impacts on crops, on farm worker health, on people everywhere. That's something we really need to start preparing for. In addition, precipitation in general will increase. However, at least in New York, we're expecting this to be concentrated in the fall and spring with more intense storm events and drier summers. So this is what we kind of are preparing for. So this leads to kind of two different motivations. One coming from the greenhouse gas mitigation aspect, where we know that our emissions are higher than we want them to be, and those need to be brought down. And what role can rural communities and agriculture in particular have in that conversation is one question, and the other is, how do we prepare for those impacts of climate change? So this really motivated a extension response from kind of three different perspectives. One being that non-governmental organizations, land trusts, folks concerned with food chain resilience and secure food sheds, as well as other public interest groups, are really pushing on this idea of climate-friendly agriculture, both the adaptation and the mitigation side of it. In addition, New York State passed the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act in 2019, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute and what that really lines out. But that's like kind of a legislative background, and specifically named Cornell University and Cornell Cooperative Extension as key players in helping to implement that. And there's also just this idea of long-term agricultural viability and needing to be resilient and adapt to climate change, and really needing to help producers in New York State work through those issues. So I've been using these terms already, and I'm guessing that most of you already know them. I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page as far as what I mean by resilience, adaptation, and mitigation. So resilience is the ability of agricultural systems, in this case, or any system really, to experience some sort of hazard. Mostly I'm talking about climate hazards here, and persist while transforming to better withstand future shocks. So really incorporating the idea to learn, to not just recover from something bad that happens, but to learn from it and get better. And then adaptation, or climate change adaptation, means altering our existing practices and implementing new strategies to meet the challenges of a changing climate, what we either expect to change or what has already changed. And mitigation here is reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So some of you might use the term mitigation in kind of a hazard mitigation context, think about flood risk mitigation. So that's more of an adaptation approach when we talk about climate change adaptation. So differentiate mitigation versus adaptation there a little bit. So now that we're all on the same page, we have a little bit of background. Let's move on to some of the more details and specifics. So the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act of 2019, or the CLCPA or Climate Act, was this major legislative initiative that really set some really strong goals in New York State for reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 85% by 2050. And not only that, but we're actually aiming to be carbon neutral by the same year. So how does that work? Well, we're going to need an additional 15% of that baseline emissions to be sequestered to make for that net neutrality. So that puts a focus on novel sequestration technology, but also really on established sequestration technology, largely meaning growing forests and managing forest land for carbon. So there have been some companion studies to this legislative action, focusing on kind of what are the economic benefits, or maybe it won't be good economically. And really what those have found is there's going to be a net economic benefit of around $100 billion in New York State, and this will on net create jobs. There's going to be a 10-to-1 ratio of jobs created to jobs displaced, and 2/3 of the displaced jobs will be at gas stations. And that's because we're really largely focusing on an electrification approach, and electrified cars aren't going to be stopping at gas stations. So there you go. But again, a 10-to-1 job creation to displacement ratio, with over 250,000 jobs being created by 2050. So this was kind of legislative goals, a mandate to accomplish this without a whole lot of details. What this law did is it created a climate action council, similar to many other states, that have drafted a scoping plan and will soon release a final version of that scoping plan as far as how we should get this done. So really, like I mentioned, there's a focus on electrification, increasing efficiency, and on renewable energy production. And within the sector of agriculture, forestry, and working lands, there's a focus on sequestering carbon in forests and harvested wood products, sustainable forest management, and potentially, like I was referring to earlier, sequestering carbon in soil through sustainable soil management and building soil health. There's also, and you saw this in the greenhouse gas inventory slides, a significant need to reduce methane emissions from both manure management and animal feeding. So that features strongly in this plan as well. There's also emphasis on just general soil health practices, and we'll get into some of the more specifics as far as what practices we're considering here in New York in a little bit. Because so much of this is focused around mitigation opportunities, I want to take a second to talk about what makes good mitigation. And these are really general principles. This isn't New York specific in any way. Some of this is a little bit shocking, maybe. So I'm just going to jump into the middle and look at that fourth box from the left that says additional. So good mitigation should be additional to what would happen in a business as usual case. And it should, or with existing regulation, which might be a little bit surprising. It was to me when I was kind of learning about this, but the more you think about it, it starts to make sense that if this is something that makes sense economically, is that really going to count as an increased mitigation? So when we're designing a new policy, we want to create things that are additional to what's happening already. And I think the rest of it makes a lot more sense. Real mitigation opportunities, well, yeah, it should actually have happened. You need to be accounting for all the different greenhouse gases, right? You can't just shift the mitigation from being in the form of carbon dioxide to some other greenhouse gas that you don't account for. And it needs to be permanent. Right? If you're talking about growing biomass, and then burning it right away, is that really a permanent sequestration of that carbon, or is it just a tightly closed loop? And there are benefits to renewable biomass use, and they do feature in the scoping plan, but there is some question about the permanence of that as a mitigation method. In addition, it needs to be verifiable. It needs to be something that can be accurately measured, either directly or indirectly. So that's something like burning methane emissions, looking for fugitive emissions and flaring them off because methane is worse than carbon dioxide. And then getting into the idea of leakage. So if we do something here in New York that reduces our emissions but also reduces our agricultural yields, and therefore we need to import more grain from Minnesota, and now there's more emissions in Minnesota, well, that's not good mitigation. We don't want to just look at New York's borders alone, or any region's borders alone. We need to think about this as the global issue that it is. So with that in our minds, let's go ahead and look at some of the key practices that we're going to be focusing on here in New York at the very least. So there was a really important and significant report that came out in 2020 by my colleagues Jennifer Whiteman and Peter Woodbury, who looked at a lot of different potential practices and kind of rated them on those criteria that we just talked about, looking at how real is this opportunity, how significant is it, how achievable is it, things like that. And so a lot of those fit into what I'm going to talk about today. They also looked at some more holistic, more statewide level possible mitigation opportunities, such as reducing food waste and renewable energy, and then sustainable feed management. And those are really important, potentially huge opportunity to reduce emissions, right? The more efficiently you can use the resources that we have as far as reducing food waste, the less work and less emissions we need to put into producing food that's not going to get eaten. I think the argument is pretty clear and well understood there. So I want to take a couple minutes and get into kind of 6 key practices that may have some applicability to Minnesota. Some of them may not, but I think almost all of them will have some use or spark some idea for you all. So first, let's talk about manure storage, cover, and flare. The idea here is that large manure lagoons, large manure pits that are uncovered go anaerobic and produce methane gas that is, according to our 20-year global warming potential here in New York, 84 times more potent than carbon dioxide. And even at a 100-year time frame, it's 24 times more potent than carbon dioxide. So by burning off that methane, by capturing it with some sort of cover and burning it off, we can reduce and achieve a real, verifiable greenhouse gas emissions reduction. And there's a huge potential here in New York State. This is estimated that by implementing this practice, we could reduce emissions by 4.3 million metric tons of CO2 equivalents per year at a cost of about $4 per metric ton, which is pretty low, really. So this has become the kind of the cornerstone of one of the key grant programs, the Climate Resilient Farming Grant Program that's administered by New York State. And they've invested a significant amount, several $1 million over the last 6 years into helping farmers and dairy producers build these on their farms and maintain them. And then, like most practices that we'll talk about today, this also has some co-benefits, right? So when your manure lagoon is covered, you're preventing rainwater from entering the manure, which means that when you're hauling that manure to spread it on fields, you're not hauling, it's more concentrated, you're not hauling all that rainwater. There's a lower chance of it overflowing and contaminating the environment. And there's higher nitrogen concentrations in the manure itself, so it's more valuable. You also don't have the odor issues. It's good for neighbor relations. And in some systems, you can use the separated manure solids to create very high quality bedding that actually some research shows is good for cow health. And there's a lot more details. If you're interested in any of these practices in more detail, you're more than welcome to reach out to me and I can get you more details. So one question I get a lot on this practice in particular is why not just burn the gas? And you can use an anaerobic digester. The main issues there are that it's really expensive, and there's a chance the methane is going to leak out. And I'm also looking at the time, and I think I'll speed up just a little bit to make sure that we can get through all of this. So I've also mentioned a couple times enhanced forest management. So in New York, 60% of farms own some amount of forest land, and that's divided between 700,000 private landowners, with a relatively small amount of publicly owned forest land. So there's a lot of emphasis on talking to those forest landowners about how do we manage these for carbon storage, what's the best way, and how do we manage it for carbon storage versus the rate of carbon sequestration. And there's one of the key parts of that scoping plan is amending the forest tax law in New York to not just reward people for managing their forest for timber, but also for multiple benefits, ecosystem services, and carbon and climate. And similar to managing existing forests, well, we also want to expand the amount of forests in New York State, looking just at marginal ag land, underutilized agricultural land. That Whiteman and Woodbury report estimated there's 1.7 million acres owned by farmers that is not currently being used in agriculture that could be reforested at a potential sequestration of nearly 5 million metric tons of carbon. The main issue here is competing land uses, right? We're also focusing on solar energy and grassland, and potentially we might want to reactivate some of this as agricultural land. So how is that all going to work together? We need smart policies that will make that make sense. It also requires significant cost, and there are some grant programs that we have to help farmers with that reforestation effort. But of course, there's logistical hurdles to participating in those. Energy efficiency, and just like we push on this in suburban and urban environments and in homes throughout the country, energy efficiency is probably one of the best ways. Every kilojoule of energy that you don't use is it reduces greenhouse gas emissions in a very real way. So just think about what's good in your house: efficient appliances, good insulation, heating and cooling, things like that. And then expanding on that, ventilation and refrigeration at scale in agricultural environments. And one very tangible example of this, heat lamps are often used for keeping baby animals warm. We can switch those to heating mats that more efficiently provide that same level of heat. So within Extension, we've developed a great resource, Ag Energy NY, and I'll share a link to that in a little bit as well. And then soil health is we all agree that soil health is good. Healthy soils are more productive. Healthy soils are more resilient. So this is something that we mainly focus on for the resilience and adaptation benefits as storms get more severe, increasing the infiltration rate, as well as water holding capacity to deal with drought. It's going to be one of the key benefits here. There's also some work being done showing that cover cropping and maximizing continuous living roots and all the same soil health practices that we're familiar with can help sequester soil, in addition to directly putting soil containing amendments such as biochar into the soil. Agroforestry is a very broad set of practices, including alley cropping, silvopasture, forest farming, riparian buffers, shelter belts, and there's a lot of work being done on all of these. But a lot of this is very new to farmers. There's a lot of excitement, a lot of interest, but a lot of support is needed in kind of transitioning into this. And one of the main benefits here is kind of diversifying what you're growing on a farm. Instead of just growing beef for slaughter, you could be growing a timber crop as well that will mature at a different rate, provide income at a different time. And all sorts of different combinations are possible there. And it's also worth noting here that because the sequestration that's happening here is in the trees above ground, it's very easy to measure. And the permanence, like I think I've mentioned with trees before, what happens to that tree after it's cut down? Is it getting burned, or is it getting used in some sort of durable wood product? And that really determines how permanent this is as a carbon sequestration method. And one issue that I think we're experiencing nationwide is that our forestry support services and our agricultural support services have traditionally been very separate from each other. And to really support agroforestry, we need to bring those closer together. So, and I think that transitions well into kind of what are the barriers to adopting these practices? Why are people not going for it more? And the number one is cost, right? Nobody's going to make an investment that's going to hurt them financially. This is a very competitive, low margin activity generally. So how much money is this going to cost to implement? How much time is it going to take? And where can I get support for this? Are the main questions that I get from people. Even people who are very internally motivated, really want to tackle climate change, contribute to the mitigation effort. It needs to make financial sense. And then there's additional challenges around knowledge and just needing to know, what can I do? How can I do it? Where can I get resources to make it work? Do I have the right equipment? Particularly when you talk about soil health practices like no-till planting, there's specialized equipment that is very rare and not needed very often that you need to make that work. Also securing land tenure. A lot of these are things that do make economic sense, but over a long time period. This is particularly true when it comes to anything involving tree planting or agroforestry. To see a return from that takes 7 to 10 years for things like nut crops or tree fruit, or even longer if you're harvesting the timber out of it. The figure on the right shows kind of various barriers that farmers might feel in relationship to climate change adaptation. And then they were asked to rank those as not at all significant, a little significant, somewhat significant, significant, or very significant on kind of a 1 through 5 scale. And this is a sample of farmers in Southwest Washington, as well as Skåne, which is the southern province of Sweden, in the yellow bars. So what you can see here is that regulatory burden barriers are perceived as being very significant. Cost barriers are perceived as being also quite significant. And kind of these knowledge barriers are actually the lowest. So in general, farmers kind of know what they could be doing. They kind of know how. They just need kind of the resources, which are seen as kind of a moderate barrier: land, labor, water, things like that. But really, mostly they need the money, and they need a supportive regulatory environment. And while these are results from Washington and Sweden, I think that those are systems that are relatively similar to what we're dealing with in both Minnesota and New York. So I would consider the general trend here to be reasonable. I do want to note, especially around that knowledge barrier, this is not a random sample of farmers. This is a biased sample that it was sent out to respondents that were connected to extension, respondents that were connected to soil and conservation districts, but it was very clear in the informed consent statement that this was a survey about climate change. And if we just think about who's likely to respond to that type of survey, I think it is a slightly biased sample. So what are we doing to address those barriers? Well, in New York State, there's several significant grant programs. I mentioned the Climate Resilient Farming Grant Program before. Regenerate New York helps with reforestation efforts. And we're also kind of piggybacking on existing environmental and water quality initiatives, which is also kind of the case at the national level with the NRCS grant programs, EQIP, or the Environmental Quality Incentive Program, and the Conservation Stewardship Program, CSP. SARE farmer grants can also be very helpful in implementing some of these innovative practices, as well as extending that knowledge beyond just the people who are implementing it. Also of note, in that scoping plan for the Climate Act, we're calling for payment for ecosystem services, which means that we're actually going to pay people for the amount of carbon that they sequester or the work that they do to reduce emissions. And what that's going to actually look like, we're not sure of yet. That's still being developed. So then specific to myself, I do a lot of work around the education and knowledge component. So I recently ran another survey of extension agents throughout New York State, asking them to rank on the y-axis how important it is for their audience to learn about various practices. And then on the x-axis, how much they already know about this practice. So in that, on the line, those are practices where I think, within the system, we can already meet the need. What extension agents already know is sufficient for how much they think their audience should know. So in the practices that are above that line, where it's more important for their audience to learn something than would be predicted, than they think that they already know, that's where I'm going to be focusing. So practices like silvopasture and agroforestry, solar energy, efficient irrigation, water storage for drought resilience, things like that. And finally, one question I get asked a lot is, how do we talk to people about climate change, right? This is a very politically charged topic, very hard conversation for a lot of people to have. And the number one advice here is meet people where they're at. If somebody's ready and raring to go, bring that same energy. But if somebody's a little bit skeptical, you want to talk to them talk about how it can benefit them, talk about the dual benefits that all of these practices have, right? As we're going through that short list. It's not just the climate benefits to most of these. There's environmental benefits, there's economic benefits to some of them, all of those different possibilities, and just really staying very fact-based. And bring good decision support tools and listen to their goals and make it a two-way conversation so that people feel heard. And a lot of this is just normal, good communication. So I know I sped through a little bit of the last bit, but that is what I have for you all today. Happy to entertain any questions, happy to go back and elaborate on anything as well. And feel free to reach out or follow us on social media. I am part of a team of 2 who address these issues statewide full-time. So a lot of our work is talking to other extension agents and getting ideas from people in the community as well.
Thanks, Zach. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen just for a second here. And then we'll get into the Q&A. Okay. So I had one other thing I did kind of want to plug here was before we go into the Q&A session, and feel free for anyone who has questions to add those into the Q&A. Do want to plug the Minnesota Climate Adaptation Awards, which is a component of the annual Minnesota Climate Adaptation Conference, which will be happening in January 2023. So for anyone in Minnesota, if you know any individual, organization, business in the kind of world of climate change, adaptation, mitigation, resilience, who is doing just an exceptional job of adapting or combating climate change, you can nominate them. You can find more information and nominate them at climate.umn.edu/awards. And that ends October 31st, so it's coming up fast. So let's go ahead and go into the Q&A. I think I'll stop sharing for the time being, but so a couple questions here, and I have some myself, Zach. But first would be referencing the tax law for forest management. And I guess maybe I'll also ask whether that's a state tax law or federal, but along with that, has it actually been amended at this point to recognize carbon as a product, or is that still in the proposal stage?
Great question. And I'm not muted, perfect. And I now looking at the actual time, I realized I did go very fast through all of that.
Oh,
so I'll slow down with the answers a little bit. So that's a state level tax law. So we have what's called 480A, and that's a way of designating existing forest land of sufficient parcel size that you're managing for timber production and getting a significant tax write-off on that if you have a written management plan. So there's a lot of barriers to entry to that some folks are not super happy about. So there's a lot of debate around that. But the idea is, the proposal is to expand that with 2 additional similar sections of tax code that would extend that property tax reduction to forest land parcels of smaller size that are managed for ecosystem benefits as well as carbon sequestration. And that is still a proposal at this point. I am hopeful personally that it will become a reality and kind of help folks get into that program.
Yeah, and I guess I'll also add the comment that other states have a similar managed forest tax law. I know Wisconsin does. I actually don't know if Minnesota does. We have another question here from Lori, and I think, Zach, this one relates somewhat to you had that framework that let me think about this. Good mitigation has to be permanent, verifiable, it have some additionality to it, and I think that's the main key here. But I'll just go ahead and read this. this question here, but the question is, are calculations looking at whole cost accounting for farms, meaning not just farm gate specific, but looking at truth in accounting for farm inputs traveling across oceans to the U.S., emissions within the farm, and again traveling across oceans in the U.S. at harvest. Why aren't U.S. farm subsidies centered around those who already, in a measured way, providing ecosystem services, use little to zero foreign inputs, etc.? I mean, that's a big question, comment, but I don't know if you had any thoughts about that. I know the additionality thing is, in agriculture, I feel like is a very big aspect of this.
Absolutely. And looking and that leakage idea as well, right? If you do something on a farm that has an off-target impact in a different sector or in a different geographic area, how do we assess that? How do we make sure that's happening? And it deals a lot with consumer demand and just supply and demand economics that make it a super complex question. I am not knowledgeable enough to really address the national level subsidy question that's in there, but I think it is a very worthwhile thing to consider.
Yeah. And Lori kind of followed up too, and this is more just a comment, that there's little to no regulation for planting or farm methods practices that the surveys that you showed as a barrier.
Mm-hmm. One response to that, I think, so thinking about that survey data, which it was my thesis work, so I did a whole lot of thinking about that survey data. I think one of the things there that folks might have been thinking about is some of the requirement. If you want to participate in a federal, or in that case, state program around, for example, riparian buffer planting and get support for that type of practice, there's rules about how big that planting needs to be that many farmers find prohibitive. So I think a lot of the folks who might be ranking those barriers as very substantial are actually the folks who are very excited about the practice, but just not quite in the way that regulation wants them to do it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a question that kind of relates to that survey as well. It seemed to me from looking at just the bars without any context that there maybe would be some differences between farmers in Washington state versus farmers in Sweden. And I was just wondering if you might comment on that, kind of among those different categories of regulation or cost barriers. What do some things kind of shake out as being more important for one group versus the other?
Yeah, definitely. Sadly, as far as statistical analysis, sample sizes were too low to show really strong differences between the two groups, but there were some. It's been a while since I presented on this, so I don't have them super off my hand, but just looking at those bars, some that jump to mind, one particularly around glyphosate and the use of that herbicide. In the European Union, of which Sweden is a member, there's a significant push to flat out ban glyphosate, which is a significant challenge when you talk about regenerative practices like no-till agriculture, where herbicides are relied upon. So there's this paradox of, do you want us, from a farmer's perspective, do you want us to engage in no-till agriculture, or do you want us to not use herbicides? It's kind of an either-or perception. And I don't think that conversation was at the forefront of the survey respondents' minds as much in the US. Also, another big difference is kind of the way that we handle technical service provision in the two contexts is very different. In the US, we have a very strong university-led extension system that many of us are probably a part of. And I think that is the main way that a lot of folks, at least in this work, were accessing additional information and asking questions. Versus in Sweden, there's a lot more emphasis on private crop consultants. And I think that led to different perceptions of barriers as well. And you can also look at one I would draw your attention to. Climate change uncertainty was seen as much more significant in Southwest Washington than it was in Skåne. In reality, the data behind that, both regions were expecting very similar impacts, and both regions had very similar amounts of research on the topic. It was just the way that topic was politicized and polarized and conveyed that that in Sweden it wasn't such a loaded topic, and I think allowed people to have more certainty about what would be happening, and less concern about that uncertainty and whether this is even a problem.
One quick note, I have to eat my own words from earlier today, or just a few minutes ago. The awards event I kind of mentioned with Climate Adaptation Partnership is not combined with the conference this year. So it'll actually be at the Bell Museum on St. Paul campus in January. But some of those details will be forthcoming. But anyways, getting back to questions, I'm going to jump ahead to one here real quick. While it's good to capture biogas from a covered lagoon, why not use the biogas as a green energy source? And I think you did talk about this a little bit, or kind of brushed on this, but you might elaborate a little more. And Greg, this is from Greg Jason. He said, power can be generated with micro turbines since heat steam is normally not required on a farm. And that policy incentives, as well as policy support, is normally required to make economics work for early adopters. So has New York considered any sort of policy for that?
Yeah, so that's a good question. It really depends on what your goals are. And I just put back up the slide that I do have addressing that question. And my basic answer is, if you can use the gas on farm where it's generated to produce either process heat, if you have some use for it, though as you point out, that seems unlikely, or to produce electricity, that's great, go for it. Where we get into issues is when you're entering that gas into a pipeline that is liable to leak. That can create, well, quite literally, a leakage issue. And there are some large dairies in upstate New York that do have anaerobic digesters and are selling that as renewable natural gas into pipelines and receiving credits in the California carbon market for doing so. Which, good for them, that they've found a way to monetize that and get a reward for that. And I think that's great. On the other hand, this is hugely expensive. It's something that only works at significant scale. So when I talk about cover and flare, I'm really focused on the affordable, cost-effective, immediate way to dramatically reduce the greenhouse gas potential of that point source emission. And for that, cover and flare is cost-effective and good at what it's supposed to do. And I think that's why that's really been the main focus here in New York. But I agree that if there's some smart use through digestion or other use of that gas on site, that could be very viable. Right.
So okay.
I was just say, I also want to take this chance to say I don't speak for New York, for the state of New York in any official capacity.
Good to clarify those things. A couple more things that kind of relate to the lagoons and mirror coverage. One thing that I wanted to kind of both sort of, I guess, ask about and comment on would be that time horizon of greenhouse gas reduction, because when you broke apart the kind of you had the pie chart of ag-related emissions. And one of the things that I found interesting was dairy manure was pretty higher than I would expect, and nitrogen management was lower than I would expect. So maybe if you could kind of comment on just like some of the differences between the time horizon of like 20 years versus 100 years in terms of that, and whatever the specifics you want to talk about, but just kind of like why focus on one versus the other.
Yeah, and I don't have a good answer to why that 20-year time horizon was selected. What I can say is that by choosing that 20 years over the 100 years, methane becomes a little over 3 times worse, and nitrous oxide becomes, I think it's a 10% increase in how bad nitrous oxide is relative to carbon dioxide. What that means is that enteric fermentation from the dairy industry and other livestock, which comes in the form of methane, becomes a lot worse, 3 times worse, more than 3 times worse. Manure anaerobic manure management, also 3 times worse. So those sections of that pie chart get a lot bigger. I wish I had the two side by side so I could show you. I don't, but those are going to be huge differences. And I think I do wish I had a better sense of why we chose that 20-year time frame. One thing I can think of there is we're setting goals in 2050, which is only 38 or 28, 30 years away from now. So using a 100-year time frame might not make sense when you want to have achieved this goal in only a third of that time. Yeah, I think that would be most of my response to that. We also have, dairy is probably the #1 economic sector in New York State. That's a huge contributor statewide, just a huge amount of large dairies and just milk production and yogurt production and cheese production going on in New York.
Yeah.
So it is a big target.
And it kind of I guess a comment I'd make from kind of, I guess, my background in agriculture too would be, one of the interesting things, and this relates to the permanent and verifiable and additionality, and essentially, well, the permanency aspect is one thing with the manure management or the nitrogen management is those aren't really reversible in the sense that if you're storing manure with coverage and then applying it, the kind of lifetime emissions don't all of a sudden spike when you change your management. It's like each bit of manure is kind of, you're reducing that and it doesn't kind of come back later, versus like soil carbon sequestration, where if you do no-till for a long time and then you till it up, it might reduce or reverse some of those benefits. Starts to make a big difference.
That's a great point. Yeah, thank you.
So another comment about the lagoon covers. What bottlenecks are you currently seeing in uptake of recommendations like lagoon covers? And is the largest issue farmer uptake, or are there supply chain manufacturing barriers in producing those covers?
To my knowledge, the issue is on-farm logistics. So there's no significant supply chain shortage that I'm aware of. I think there may have been some minor delays in projects that are already on the way just because of supply chain disruptions during the pandemic and afterward. But the main issue right now is dealing with how do we actually implement this on the farm, and how do we ensure ongoing maintenance of this system? Right? This is a complex and engineered system that somebody on that farm needs to be able to maintain after it's installed and keep running for it to be effective. In addition to that, right, a lot of bedding in large dairies is done with sand, so you need to be able to separate that sand and recover it, which can be quite costly, and just another engineered component of that system that you need to get into. So we're kind of getting to the point where we've implemented a lot of these across the state, and we're starting to get to the folks who are less excited and have more concerns about the logistics of implementing it in their operations and those fine operational details. So finding the engineers and folks with the expertise and the experience to help guide people through that process is kind of where we're at now.
Great, thanks, Zach. Nancy made a couple comments here that I think probably relate to some of my tangent about this kind of share of the pie, and maybe she has some inside information here, but she was commenting that farmers spread manure, which then decreases the amount of nitrogen fertilizer needed, and talking about methane versus nitrous oxide in New York State. And I'd also say, going back to Lori's comments earlier, she said no-till can be used without chemical burn down. And, certainly in the organic community, I know there are people who do this more like roller crimping, mowing, freezing, etc. Mm-hmm. One question here from Brian that's kind of relates, I think, a lot to the extension's role. He said, I loved your talking about climate change slide, and giving the size of your team, 2 people, I guess, being the core, how do you maximize your capacity to reach broader audiences, and what kind of partners do you engage with, and in what ways?
Yeah, and that's a great topic, and that's something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about along with my colleague. And so this program, having full-time extension staff focused on climate and resilience issues, started at the beginning of 2022 when my colleague was hired, and then I joined later this year in March. So we've been really navigating that recently. And the answer is we'll work with a lot of folks. So we work with farmers directly. We do on-farm walks to talk about kind of options that they have and how they can approach these topics in their operation. But more than that, we do, we talk to other extension educators throughout the state and kind of talk to them about what could they be talking to their farmers about, what makes sense in the industry that they're serving and in the region that they're working in. We do invited presentations with them to kind of lower the burden on kind of recruiting people to come listen to us talk, and kind of we'll talk for 10 minutes in the middle of a larger soil health day. So the focus is on how do we build soil health. And then we come in for a little bit to talk about the climate impact of that and the various resiliency factors that soil health influences. So kind of building those strategic partnerships so that instead of having to talk to every farmer in New York, we can talk to a much smaller number of extension agents. And then beyond that, when we do talk to farmers, we're not out to coerce or compel people to do something. We're here to provide education and provide balanced and scientifically backed answers to their existing questions. So if somebody is just completely turned off by the word climate, we don't need to engage. There's so many people who are excited to talk about these topics and want to do something and just need advice on what makes sense for them and how to get money for it. That at least at the moment, we've had our plates full talking to folks like that. And over time, more and more people are coming around and saying, hey, this is a good idea, or realizing that there are incentive programs out there to support climate-related practices. And they might be a little bit turned off by it being called a climate-related practice, but that doesn't mean they can't participate in that program. So we also do some work to educate people on things like, hey, rotational grazing is great for your soil, it's good for your animals. And also, some people think it's a climate practice, and it probably is. And so you can access this pot of funding for that, answering questions like that. So we really are working through our colleagues within Extension. We also work a lot with our soil and water conservation districts, because they're really the partners that are out there doing the design and the kind of calculations and the implementation for a lot of these practices that we talk about. They also hold the purse strings on the grant programs that New York State offers. So they're important partners in that way as well.
Great, thanks, Zach. I guess I have one more question kind of following up on that. A lot of these things like the manure pits coverage, that's something that you have to kind of catch people at the right time, in order to get that done. Like maybe they have a pit that's no longer sufficient to their needs, the size of their operation, or that ages out for whatever reason. And I was kind of just curious what you guys have been thinking or how you're trying to approach in your engagement, like essentially catching people at the moment at or before the moment at which they're going to make those decisions.
Yeah, that's something that we mainly work with our colleagues at both Soil and Water and other extension locations on. So we have a group of kind of dairy-focused educators in different regions throughout the state that are tapped in, and they know the dairy producers. They're kind of aware of what's happening on their operations, and they hopefully would kind of catch when those changes are coming, and having them in the know and having talked to them about the different benefits of these practices and kind of why somebody might want to put a cover on their manure pit or build that into the design when they need to do some major renovation on an existing pit makes a lot of sense. So that's why we kind of work to educate other extension staff first and foremost.
Great. I don't see any other questions. So Zach, thanks so much for your time and your insight. Even being relatively new into the role, it's just really interesting to hear what's going on in New York State. Again, seeing no other questions, I think you know what? I almost missed one thing. I'm just gonna real quickly share. If we do have a survey here at the end of our for the evaluation of the webinar, if people don't mind clicking on, going to z.umn.edu/MCAP webinar eval on the screen and just filling out that survey, we really appreciate it. But other than that, again, Zach, thanks so much for your time, your expertise, and I think I'll go ahead and stop the webinar, and everyone have a great rest of your day and week. Wait, it looks like there's one. Okay. Yeah, I think actually that brings up Lori, thanks for that. We will probably, if it's all right, Zach, send just a quick follow-up email with links from this, like the Ag Energy New York site, and then probably that Whiteman and Woodbury report. And we can go ahead and, Lori, we can go ahead and email the survey. And that would be just fine. So thanks for bringing that up. All right, everyone. Again, Zach, thanks for your time, and everyone have a great day.
Thank you all so much.